In the winter of 1901, the harbor at Eastport, Maine, was a graveyard of stillness. The sea had frozen so fast it caught the tide mid-rise. Waves hardened into white walls, fishing lines sealed in sheets of ice. Locals said it was the coldest January the coast had ever known, and that the wind that blew from the Atlantic that year didn't howl, it whispered. On the morning of January 14th, 7 men from the harbor, seasoned fishermen all, set out before dawn, chasing one last catch before the bay froze for good. They never came back. The year was 1901, and the coast of Maine lay gripped beneath a winter unlike any in living memory. Eastport, a small fishing settlement clinging to the ragged edge of the Atlantic, stood frozen in silence beneath skies the color of pewter. The ocean, once alive with the hum of gulls and the groan of ships, had turned to stone. Winds swept in from the northeast carrying the scent of salt and frost, whispering through the narrow streets, rattling the windows of cottages built too close to the water. Fishermen who had weathered a lifetime of storms said they had never felt cold like it, a cold that bit through wool and leather, that stung the lungs, that seemed to reach inward toward the heart. The harbor, lifeblood of the town, began to close in upon itself day by day, as a film of ice thickened on its surface until it glimmered like dull glass. Every man knew the time for fishing was drawing to an end. One last voyage could mean the difference between a winter endured and a winter starved. That January, talk in the taverns was of hunger and debt. The sea's catch had been poor for months, and rumors spread of men selling their tools for food. Yet the sea always promised hope to those desperate enough to chase it. On the morning of the 14th, 7 men gathered at the docks before dawn, their breath clouding in the air, their oilskins stiff with frost. They were led by Captain Elias Doran, a man known for his steady hand and unshakable resolve. His crew, young Samuel Greaves among them, trusted him implicitly. The water that morning was black and still, the horizon faint beneath a veil of mist. Locals watched as the men loaded their traps, lanterns flickering against the dark water, unaware that they would never see them alive again. As the boat slipped out into the harbor, the town stirred awake. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the first light of morning glinted across the ice forming along the edges of the docks. The sound of their oars was the last echo of life before the stillness set in. By midday, the wind shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, faster than anyone could recall. In a matter of hours, the harbor began to seize, waves freezing mid-motion, trapping gulls in their descent. When night fell, the town of Eastport looked out upon a sea that had turned to crystal. Families stood on the shore, calling the men's names, but their voices carried only over a frozen wasteland. No ripples answered. No returning lanterns broke the dark. It was as if the harbor itself had swallowed them whole. The next morning brought a silence too heavy to bear. What had once been a living sea now lay entombed beneath a white and glassy shroud, and within its depths, faint shapes could be seen. Boats, nets, and the ghostly outlines of the men who had ventured too far into winter's grasp. The fishermen of Eastport were men hardened by salt, wind, and hunger, men whose faces were carved by years at sea and whose hands bore the marks of storms survived. Among them were 7 who had fished together for seasons uncounted, their bond forged through shared danger and dwindling fortune. In the bitter winter of 1901, when the harbor began to freeze faster than anyone expected, they faced a cruel choice: venture out one final time or watch their families starve. The sea was their only promise, even when it turned hostile. On that gray morning of January 14th, they prepared their boats in silence beneath a pale sun that gave no warmth. The wooden planks creaked beneath their boots as frost gathered along the ropes and sails. Captain Elias Doran stood at the bow, his eyes fixed on the horizon, a man haunted by deaths and the ghost of better years. With him were Samuel Greaves, barely 21 and full of restless defiance; Thomas Hale, whose wife had begged him not to go; brothers Caleb and Jonah Pike, inseparable since childhood; Henry Cobb, an old hand with nothing left to lose; and finally Matthew Carver, the quiet one, whose skill with nets was unmatched, but whose faith had long since waned. The air that morning carried a strange stillness. Even the gulls were silent, hovering low above the water as if sensing something amiss. The townspeople gathered along the dock, wrapped in scarves and suspicion, watching as the men pushed their boats into the dark, glassy water. The tide was sluggish, as though weighed down by the cold itself. The men rowed hard against it, their breath rising in pale clouds. Behind them, the town shrank into a faint outline, a few dim lanterns, a thin line of smoke curling into the frozen air. It was said that as they disappeared beyond the point, a distant groan echoed across the bay, deep and drawn out like the shifting of ice or the moan of something far beneath the water. As night fell, the first flakes of snow began to drift across the harbor. The temperature plummeted without warning, the wind turning sharp as glass. Those who ventured to the docks that evening found the shoreline already sealed with a crust of ice. The sea, which only hours before had rippled with movement, now seemed to stiffen into stillness. Lanterns were lit along the waterfront, their light stretching across the frozen bay in thin, trembling lines. There was no sign of the boats. Some said they saw shadows moving far out, faint and flickering, like lanterns trapped under the ice. Others dismissed it as a trick of the wind. By dawn, the harbor had become a perfect mirror, smooth and silent, reflecting the gray of the sky so completely that sea and heaven seemed one. And somewhere beneath that unbroken surface lay the missing men, 7 fishermen caught in a moment between storm and stillness, suspended in time, their fate sealed by a single night's frost. When morning came, the people of Eastport gathered along the shoreline, their boots crunching over frost, their breaths hanging in the still air. The harbor, once restless and alive, had transformed into a glassy expanse of pale blue ice that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. What drew everyone's gaze, however, was the impossible sight beneath that surface. The fishermen's boats, trapped mid-harbor, preserved as if frozen in a single breath of time. The vessels stood perfectly intact, their sails stiff with frost, nets still half-cast, ropes suspended like veins in crystal. Lanterns lay frozen mid-sway, their flames extinguished but their shapes caught in eerie detail beneath the translucent ice. It looked as though the men had vanished in an instant, leaving behind a scene that defied sense or mercy. Mothers and wives pressed their faces close to the surface, searching for signs of life, but the ice was too thick and the water below too dark. The silence that blanketed the harbor that day felt sacred and suffocating. No one could explain how it had happened so fast. The night before, the sea had still been open water. It would have taken hours of impossible cold to lock the entire harbor in ice. Yet the boats appeared as though they had been caught mid-motion, the tide stilled in its climb. Some of the older townsmen whispered that it wasn't natural. They spoke of a phenomenon they called the sudden freeze, a storm so cold that it could steal a man's breath before he could cry out. But others swore there was something else beneath the surface. Something that had taken the men before the ice closed in around them. A few who looked closely claimed to see faint outlines below the boats, shapes that moved when the light shifted, as if the sea itself were still restless beneath its frozen shell. In the following days, townspeople made cautious attempts to reach the vessels. They ventured out onto the ice with axes and ropes, testing every step. The sound of their tools striking the surface echoed across the harbor like muffled thunder. But no matter how deep they cut, they could not reach the boats. The ice seemed thicker around them, layered and dense, as if the sea had deliberately sealed them away. One man claimed he heard a hollow tapping from beneath his feet, 3 sharp knocks followed by silence. He dropped his axe and refused to return. At night, Eastport lay awake listening to the groans of the frozen harbor. The wind carried strange noises across the bay, long creaks, hollow rumbles, and sometimes what sounded like faint voices. No one dared to speak of it openly, but many believed the men were still down there, not dead, but caught in some unholy stillness between life and the deep. And so, beneath the pale winter moon, the harbor became both grave and witness, a frozen monument to a mystery the sea itself refused to give back. In the weeks that followed the disappearance, the town of Eastport existed in a state of uneasy half-belief, caught between grief and disbelief. The harbor, sealed beneath a white mirror of ice, seemed almost alive. At night, the stillness was broken by strange rhythmic sounds, faint knocks that echoed from beneath the surface, as though someone were striking the hull of a boat trapped below. Some said it was the ice shifting with the tide, the natural voice of the frozen sea. Others, whispering by firelight, swore they heard voices carried through the frost. Murmurs that rose and faded with the wind, calling the names of the lost fishermen. The widows gathered near the docks, lanterns in hand, listening in the silence, praying that the sounds were a sign of life. But the longer they listened, the less human those noises began to seem. The first to speak of it publicly was young Isaac Rourke, a dockhand who had been helping to haul barrels near the shore one night when he heard a sharp rapping. 3 knocks, then 2, then silence. He claimed it came from directly beneath him, from deep within the ice. When he crouched to listen, he felt a vibration beneath his palms, like something moving far below. He ran home pale as milk and refused to return to the harbor for days. After that, others began reporting the same thing. The fishermen's wives heard what sounded like dragging, a slow scraping that traveled beneath the ice in long, sweeping arcs. One claimed she saw a shadow pass under the frozen surface, its shape long and human, gliding with unnatural grace. Another said she saw the imprint of fingers pressed against the ice before fading like breath on glass. By late January, the entire town had grown restless. The minister tried to quiet talk of spirits, insisting the noises were caused by expanding ice and trapped air pockets. But even he admitted, in confidence, that the patterns of the knocks were too deliberate, too rhythmic to be random. On the coldest nights, the sounds grew louder, sharp cracks echoing across the harbor, followed by hollow thuds that seemed to travel from one side to the other. The dogs would whine and pull toward the shore, refusing to go near the water. Some men tried breaking through to investigate, but the moment they struck the ice, the knocking stopped. Children began to speak of the tapping men, imaginary figures who called from beneath the harbor when the moon was full. They would mimic the knocks on walls and tables, driving their parents into quiet dread. Soon, no one lingered by the waterfront after dark. The entire town seemed to breathe with the frozen sea, waiting, listening, half expecting those long lost fishermen to claw their way back from beneath the ice that had become their tomb. When the thaw finally began in early March, it came with a groan that rolled across the harbor like thunder. The ice cracked in long, jagged lines, splitting the still surface that had held its secrets for nearly 2 months. The townsfolk, weary from grief and sleepless nights, gathered once more at the water's edge, watching as the sea began to reclaim itself. The air smelled of brine and decay, and every sound of breaking ice made hearts quicken with both dread and hope. It was the widow of Captain Doran who first spotted something beneath the melting crust, a dark shape drifting upward as though released from the depths. When the men pulled it free, the body that surfaced was frozen solid, face turned toward the gray sky, hands raised as if clawing for escape. The horror of it silenced the crowd. Within days, 2 more bodies rose from beneath the retreating ice. They were found a few yards apart, half encased in translucent sheets that glistened like glass under the weak sunlight. Their positions were grotesque, arms extended upward, fingers curled, mouths open in eternal screams. Yet their skin bore no frostbite, no bruises or wounds, no sign of struggle except for the terror carved into their expressions. The coroner, summoned from Machias, examined them in the old boathouse where the smell of salt and death clung to the air. He could only shake his head. "They drowned without drowning," he murmured. "No water in the lungs, no cold in the blood. It's as though the sea stopped their hearts before the ice took them." Word spread quickly. Reporters came from as far as Bangor, eager to document the so-called men beneath the glass. Some believed they had been caught by a sudden freeze and suffocated beneath the surface, but old sailors scoffed at that. The ice had sealed too swiftly, too cleanly. Others whispered of gas pockets, strange currents, or poison in the air. But for those who had heard the knocking weeks before, the sight of the frozen men seemed like confirmation that something alive, or unholy, had lingered beneath. The town tried to give the dead a proper burial, yet the ground was still too hard to dig, and so their bodies were laid in the church cellar, where candles burned through the night. It was said that the air inside never warmed, no matter how many flames were lit. The remaining families prayed for the others, the 4 still missing, but no more bodies surfaced. When the harbor finally thawed completely, divers were sent out, though few were willing to descend into those depths. Those who did returned, pale and shaken, claiming they saw shadows below that moved even when the water was still. The official report listed the deaths as accidental. The townspeople called it something else. A warning carved in ice, a message from the sea itself that some mysteries are meant to stay buried beneath the thawing silence of winter's grave. When the investigation began, it was led not by outsiders, but by the townsfolk themselves, for no one from Augusta or Boston cared to journey into that cold corner of Maine. Sheriff Alden Pike, a man of few words and fewer illusions, took charge. He had fished these waters in his youth, knew every tide, every current, and every face in Eastport. He walked the docks with his lantern long after dark, studying what the sea had returned and what it had not. The 3 recovered bodies were examined in the small church hall that had been turned into a makeshift morgue. Beside them lay the personal effects dredged from the ice, torn nets, cracked lanterns, and one waterlogged journal belonging to Samuel Greaves, its cover sealed with a waxed thread. When opened, the writing inside was smeared and fading, but the last legible entry chilled everyone who read it. The water groans tonight. It sounds alive. That single line lingered in the minds of all who heard it, as if hinting at something watching from below the ice that night. Sheriff Pike's men combed the harbor once the thaw had cleared enough to move the boats. The recovered vessels, when pulled ashore, seemed strangely untouched. No sign of collision, no splintering of wood, not even a mark of ice damage that could explain the tragedy. And yet, inside one of them, a hammer was found wedged deep into the gunwale, as though struck there in panic. Another boat had a section of rope twisted so tightly it had cut into the wood, the kind of mark that only comes from something pulling hard from below. The nets, too, were tangled in ways no fisherman could explain. Some appeared to have been cut, others burned by some unknown heat that left no ash or soot behind. The few who dared to speak their suspicions did so in whispers. Some said the men had turned on each other in madness, driven insane by the cold. Others believed they had stumbled upon something beneath the harbor, a sinkhole, a vent, or perhaps something far older than the sea itself. But Pike, practical as he was, found no evidence of violence between them. What disturbed him most was the condition of their tools. Several harpoons and gaffs were missing entirely, though no one could fathom how they had vanished beneath the ice. He wrote in his report that the scene felt arranged, as though the harbor had staged its own story. As weeks passed, the sheriff's efforts led only to questions. The journal, the ropes, the untouched hulls, none of it aligned with reason. He sent word to state officials for assistance, but no one came. The case was quietly closed as a maritime accident, and the remaining families were left to mourn without answers. Still, Pike kept the journal locked in his desk for years, returning to that single phrase when sleep eluded him. The water groans tonight. It sounds alive. Even in his later years, he would say that every time the harbor froze over, he could swear he heard that same low groaning rise again from beneath the ice, as if the sea were remembering. In the years that followed, the story of the frozen harbor spread beyond Eastport, carried by sailors and traders along the New England coast. It became a whisper in taverns, a fireside tale told on nights when the sea roared too loud to ignore. Locals began to call it the Frozen Harbor Mystery, a name that stuck, for no better explanation ever came. The deaths of the 7 fishermen were written off in official ledgers as an accident caused by sudden freezing and exhaustion. But no one in Eastport truly believed that. Those who had seen the ice, who had heard the knocks and the cries beneath it, could not forget. The event became more than a tragedy. It became a haunting. The harbor itself felt changed, as if the sea had taken something from the town and refused to give it back. The families of the lost men left one by one. The widows moved inland to stay with relatives, leaving behind shuttered cottages that stared blankly toward the sea. Fishermen who remained began avoiding the deeper waters, claiming that their nets came up torn or twisted, as though caught on something alive. A few swore they saw faces beneath the ice the next winter, not clear, but faint and shifting, like pale reflections just beneath the surface. The children of Eastport grew up hearing that the harbor was cursed, that the sea there did not forgive. By the time a decade had passed, no one fished beyond the mouth of the bay. The harbor froze earlier each winter, and its silence grew heavier, as if the ocean itself remembered the night it took the 7 men. Years later, In 1921, a team of divers arrived from Portland, drawn by the legend that still lingered in maritime circles. They came equipped with new suits, heavy hoses, and curiosity hardened by science. The people of Eastport watched them with wary eyes as they descended into the same waters that had once entombed the fishermen. When they resurfaced, their faces were pale, their voices unsteady. They claimed they had found remnants of the boats lying like skeletons in the silt, their wood preserved unnaturally well by the cold. But there was something else. A bell, upright and unbroken, half buried in the mud, its clapper still inside. When they brought it to the surface and struck it once, the sound that rang out was clear, almost beautiful. But as the note faded, the bell cracked clean down the middle, splitting like ice in spring. None of the divers returned to those waters again. The mystery of the frozen harbor remains unsolved. Historians call it an anomaly of weather and misfortune. The devout call it a punishment or a sign. Yet every winter, when the first layer of ice spreads across the bay, those who still live in Eastport say the air grows heavy and the wind falls silent, as though listening. And if you stand on the shore at dusk, they say, you might hear it, the faint echo of a bell, and beneath it, the distant sound of something knocking beneath the ice. What truly happened beneath the frozen waters of Eastport's harbor that winter? Were those men victims of nature's cruelty, or of something far older, something that still lingers beneath the ice? History records dates, names, and theories, but it cannot explain the whispers carried through a century of storms. The truth, it seems, remains sealed beneath a silence too deep to thaw. If this story left you wondering, if it stirred that quiet unease that history sometimes hides, then stay with us. There are countless more forgotten places where time stands still, and where the echoes of the past refuse to fade. Subscribe to uncover the next mystery, the next secret buried in dust, salt, and shadow. Each week, we unearth another true account from the darker side of history. Stories of loss, deception, and the unexplainable that shape the world we live in, even now. And tell us, what do you believe happened that night in 1901? Were the fishermen taken by the sea, or by something that was already waiting for them beneath the ice? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Perhaps together, we can piece together the fragments of a truth long forgotten. Until next time, keep your lanterns lit, and never turn your back on the water when it grows silent.